Welcome back to Reform Millennials, a podcast where we discuss the intersection of markets, politics, and pop culture. Please remember that the content of this show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing should be considered financial or tax advice. Please consult a professional before you make any investment decisions. Mel, it's good to chat with you again.
Good to chat with you too. So much happening in the last few weeks. My goodness. I'm like, we could probably do a standalone episode in politics on several different issues, but today we're talking
Pipelines. We can talk about Alberta. We can talk about energy. There's so much exciting happening in the political sphere of Canada that it almost, for a week there, we ignored the United States. And for that, I'm grateful.
Yeah. People
were paying attention to our market, our political sphere, things that are actually important to us rather than the sideshow down south that consumes us. So I think that for that, clearly something great happened.
Great did happen.
I think so.
Is expected to happen in the future, as we say. We were chatting before we started pressing record here, and we'll get into the topic of what this actually all means. But yeah, good news, I think, at the outset.
Yeah, 100%. There's no doubt that this signals a move to the middle for the Liberal Party. I would also argue that it signals the same for the Alberta UCP that has, I think, depending on who you ask, has conceded a few things with the hope of receiving what it truly wants. There's clearly the political theater was, to me, growth-oriented and a path forward. For the first time in what feels like a decade, we're making steps in the right direction to benefit the country, to benefit our specific province and the people that live here. And that is incredibly encouraging. How did you view, I mean, you were just at the Alberta AGM. How is the emotion and the I don't know, like, what was the temperature like?
Yeah. So maybe, do you want to get into just doing like a quick overview of exactly what happened? And then we could get into all the like political
that's a good idea.
Political responses. I feel like there's two important political responses, which we'll get into, is talking about the response that Carney actually got in the room on Thursday at the Calgary Chamber of Commerce event, and then sort of like what's happening in political circles. But we'll spend a lot of time talking about that. So maybe just for those who have been living under a rock, no offense, but I think every single person in Alberta and perhaps Canada has heard about the MOU that got announced on November 27th, last Thursday, between Alberta and the federal government when it comes to getting a pipeline built to the Pacific West Coast of Canada. So we'll link the MOU text in the newsletter when we send that out later this week, but it is actually quite simple MOU in terms of, it's not like a huge legal document. It's essentially a bullet paper that's 5-6 pages long that outlines what Alberta and the government of Canada have agreed to. Now, this secret, I will say, was probably one of the worst kept secrets in Canada over the past few weeks. And perhaps you could also say since the election earlier this year, the federal election, where Carney represented sort of a fresh start and a reset, if you will, when it comes to the relationship with provinces, but also the policy direction generally. So essentially, the government of Canada and the government of Alberta have entered into a memorandum of understanding that a bitumen pipeline to the BC coast, which is going to have at least 1 million barrels per day of low emission Alberta bitumen capacity, is going to be built. And so that's what was agreed to. So I think we can all sort of clap at that high level. If you 5 years ago were to ask most political watchers whether this was possible in the middle of 2020, 2021, of course, we were dealing with COVID then, but most people would have never thought that there would be a day where a Liberal government, the leader of the Liberal Party, was agreeing to such a step forward. And we'll talk about what it actually means in terms of tangible politics and policy. But I think we can stop and say that's great, as we've said at the beginning of the podcast. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's, again, step forward in the right direction. You could feel the positivity. I know for the first time in years, it feels like I'm having positive conversations with people, especially in the private oil and gas ecosystem here in Edmonton and Calgary. Obviously, I manage money for a number of families that have businesses that benefit from the expansion of the industry. So certainly I have a bias, but it was a marketable shift over the last week in conversation and people's attitudes, optimism, or even their view of competency at the federal government level.
Yeah.
It's just awesome. It's nice to feel for
like
the first
hope
time
as well.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's what I've been feeling as well in different circles, which is kind of nice. And I think, so the MOU, just to get into a few of the points, I think probably a lot of people have already heard a lot about it. So I think we'll probably focus most of our discussion today on the analysis part, which is what is always the most fun. But I would say that the MOU included probably more detail than a lot of people expected going into Thursday. It's not incredibly long, but it is specific in many areas and does deliver, I think, more information than I was expecting, which I think is great in terms of analyzing the politics and the market implications of such an agreement. I would say that if we were to sort of summarize the key points quickly, the MOU talked about the fact, of course, that we're going to get prioritizing this new pipeline to the Pacific West Coast in Alberta. We have a few other conditions that are part of this. We have Alberta needing to submit a proposal to the Major Projects Office by July 1st of 2026. Now, the MOU does also say that Alberta needs to be an active proponent in the project and not just a supporter. So you are going to see that government involvement in the project in a way that perhaps perfect free market wouldn't have needed in the past, but here's where we are and this is what's involved. So we'll have the provincial government as a proponent. It also includes a sort of conditional commitment as well to the Pathway Alliance project, which, as many of you know, includes many of the, about 95% of the producers of oil sands production are members of Pathways and participants of Pathways. So it creates this opportunity and this groundwork for there to be a trilateral agreement between the provincial government, the federal government, and Pathways by early April of 2026. Pathways is a condition of this project being built. So the massive CCUS project that has been, this is not a new project. This is a project that's been around for years. And so that
for those wondering, that's carbon capture.
Yep. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage, CCUS. So there's that aspect of it. There's also a commitment and a stated goal to build out data centers and power demands. We've been talking a lot about data centers on this podcast. And so that's explicitly mentioned there as well, including strengthening the interties that we have with neighboring provinces. Again, this is part of the work that Alberta has been doing through its electricity revamps over the past few years. And so it fits in nicely there, as well as developing and expanding on a nuclear strategy in Alberta, which is also highly connected to power and increased demand there. We have a question coming in while we're talking now, just talking about when the pipe is going to go into the ground. That's a great question, and I don't think anybody can answer it right now, which possibly gets into the commentary that we're going to chat about a little bit later. But roughly speaking, the dates that we see in the MOU, the first sort of big milestone date will be April 1st, 2026, when we'll see the trilateral agreement between the feds, the province, and Pathways. By this time, the province will also have to have revamped its industrial carbon pricing through the tier model to $130 a ton. Right now, it's at $95 per ton. We will also need to have a methane equivalency agreement, the Alberta government and the federal government, by April 1st. And then, of course, Alberta will have to submit its proposal to the Major Project Office as one of the proponent, hopefully finding a private sector proponent to partner with on that by July 1st of 2026. And then the nuclear strategy will be in place by 2027. So realistically speaking, we are probably not seeing pipeline in the ground before July 1st, 2026. And I think 2026 could possibly be early, but I think that would probably be the earliest date, summer of 2026, where we could be seeing something. But again, that's the deadline for submitting the proposal, not necessarily that when we'll be getting approval. So 2027, 2028, definitely more realistic when it comes to that. We'll get into a little bit of the sort of, I'm calling them conditions that Alberta has to get this MOU done, and then the concessions that Ottawa has made in terms of what it moved on, what it previously wasn't moving on. Of course, Alberta has to come to a methane equivalency agreement by April 1st of 2026. So that's a 75% reduction of 2014 levels by 2035. They need to get equivalency on increased industrial carbon tax pricing, which is our TIER fund, the Technology Innovation Emissions Reduction Fund. As many of you will know, Alberta has had an industrial carbon price since 2008, but through this MOU, we are proposing that the carbon price increases to $130 a ton by April 1st, 2026. It was always going to increase to $170 a ton to have equivalency with the feds by 2030, but this is speeding it up. We also have commitments from the Alberta government that the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation will participate, perhaps by backstopping the project on the pathway side or the pipeline side. And then Alberta does have to engage with BC as well. Quickly on the Ottawa concessions before we get into talking about the meat of this. Ottawa has, we talk about Danielle Smith's 9 bad laws, which not all of them are laws. Some of them are regulations and practices. But we do see the federal government confirm what we saw them talk about in the budget 2026 content on walking away from the federal oil and gas emissions cap. Now, those who are familiar with this policy will know that this had not actually been implemented yet, but the government is saying that they will walk away from this, which is good news. They are suspending the clean electricity regulations in Alberta, which is also good news. They are committing to the pipeline using C5, which is good news. They are agreeing to make amendments to C48, which is the tanker ban, which is good news, and then agreeing to sort of continuing on investment tax credits to support the project as well. Last thing I'll say before we get into analysis, of course, we have, one of those things between Alberta and the coast, which is a province, British Columbia. I would say that high level on the deal, Alberta was working on this with the federal government, even though it was a bad kept secret. BC does not appear to be at the grown-ups decision-making table for this project, probably largely because that would impede the federal government and Alberta government's ability to actually announce what they announced. So there is a condition that Alberta needs to engage BC as part of this process, but again, notably not at the decision-making table for this. So I'll take a breath and then we'll get into politics. Any questions on the facts of the matter, Joel?
Not really. I suppose where I'd need to, flesh out further is more so along the lines of where is the work to be done to answer the question of that was asked is like, how do we get shovels in the ground? And obviously you said by April, they need to have an outline for the carbon capture or the CCUS. Then by midsummer, July, there needs to be a proposal for the pipeline itself. I'm putting things together here. In order to justify this, you also need to see a C48 change, because if you're going to ship 1 million barrels west, you can't only have 2 tankers leaving the coast per day. It takes significantly more egress by ship to theoretically distribute to Asia. So there's things in the way. Now, as you had mentioned, there's an entire province in between Alberta and the coast, and that province itself wasn't involved. Now, perhaps you can touch on a few things for me. The federal government has the ability to ignore BC's wishes and hypothetically the Indigenous in order to push through the actual construction itself. I would also venture to guess that would be true for the Bill C-48 with regards to the tanker ban / the amendment. How much of a headwind can BC be, given that they have been largely left out of this conversation thus far?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think to answer that question, we have to take a step back and discuss and contemplate what the federal government's goal is. Because even though we've had an MOU signed between the federal government and the Alberta government, Alberta's goal is obviously to get that built. I don't think anybody is confused about that. But I think that the federal government's goals here can be a little bit more nuanced. What Carney has done and his government has done by engaging in this MOU and expressing a willingness to talk about this is he has really done a lot of he sent a signal that he's willing to play ball. Now, how he's willing to play ball and what they'll play ball on, I think remains to be seen. I think the question of what kind of a role can BC play in blocking this really has to do with, first of all, how quickly does the project advance from the perspective of what Alberta as a proponent and others as possible proponents can control. So is there a clear path for private sector involvement in this project right now? Is that going to take some time? Those are questions I think that there's still of the public record questions about. So how quickly can that side of things advance and come together? I think from the federal government side, the deadline, I guess, for the federal government to say approve, deny on things, we are talking years, not months on this stuff. So I think it is very possible that the federal government can slow play this to the extent where BC's not really on board, but them not being on board isn't necessarily going to be a problem for a little while out. I will say that from a political perspective, Carney definitely did make a political calculation in whether or not he cares about BC's support. And so they've made that calculation. And I think, of course, while they do need support in BC, they have decided that perhaps maybe they can pick up more in Alberta than on BC, and it can be sort of a national interest move on that front. So I don't know if that answers your question, Joel, but they can be a blocker, but C5 does give the federal government considerable powers to just say thanks, but no thanks when it comes to the actual ability to like impede steps moving forward. So yeah, if they do get to a point where BC is going to be a blocker, there are tools that the federal government has that they can use should they choose to, but using those tools is also not something I think Carney wants to do right away. I think that Carney, if the ball goes back into his court and he's forced to have to make a decision on whether he'll use a tool like that or not, I don't think that's exactly what he wants out of this. I think he wants to ride the wave of this announcement for as long as possible while making progress, but I don't think he necessarily wants to make those decisions right away, I would assume. I don't know what you think, but.
Okay. So with that, this is where my head's going. It's like, okay, we need to get a timeline because from an investment perspective, that matters. And markets don't care about political timelines. Well, they do, but they only to the extent in which they apply it to their models. And for me, I want to understand how the Canadian energy opportunity could theoretically shift from being a dividend buyback story to being a growth and cash flow story. And that's where we're currently sitting with regards to like the economic and investment opportunity. But where I'd like to maybe continue to dive before we jump into the financial analysis, I want to discuss the kind of the grand bargain here. And for me, what I've seen is like for a decade, you're seeing, and this is me speaking to Carney's pivot. For a decade, the Liberal strategy was to squeeze the oil sector and force a carbon transition. In that 15 years or 10, 15 years, we've effectively seen the carbon emissions flatline and then decline, and not because of consumption, mostly because of technological advancement. And that technological advancement is largely pushed forward by the United States. That doesn't even have any of these situations, or I should say, none of these bills and or constraints. most of it has been we'll call it the Inflation Reduction Act and credits, where they're incentivizing technology rather than providing, we'll call it tax headwinds for emitters. It's been quite the opposite in terms of their strategy, and what has resulted, and I think this is partially just because they have such incredibly deep capital markets, and as a result, they've been able to spend more on R&D and innovation. But that result and that reality has been that we'll call it the climate crisis has shifted slightly, where we have technology that is taking the brunt of the load. And now, from a political point of view, Carney gets to make this grand pivot where he's, in a sense, forcing a transition while acknowledging and effectively signing a peace treaty with Danielle Smith, which is this weird, genuine ideological shift into a pragmatic energy independent strategy. And that, as I think him having great political instincts, but also benefiting from not having to lean as heavy on, we'll call it carbon tax / consumption reduction policy, and now being able to shift because we have effectively created enough technological advancement that allows for us to attack the climate crisis in a new way. So to me, what do you view Guilbeault's resignation meaning? How do you see Smith's concession playing out in Alberta? And maybe dive first into the Guilbeault resignation, and then I'd like to maybe talk a little bit more about Smith post.
Yeah, so the Guilbeault resignation just hours after this MOU was announced tells me that Carney is playing pragmatic politics more than Trudeau ever wanted to. I think that you see sort of this exodus of Trudeau era confidants like Freeland, like Guilbeault, like others sort of exit stage left. Or exit stage right when it comes to their involvement around the decision-making table. And I think what Carney's challenge is going to be internally is that he is going to upset some people within his caucus when it comes to the environmental side of things. He is going to ruffle feathers in certain regions of Canada where this matters a lot, notably Quebec, where support for pipelines is not what it is in Alberta or Saskatchewan, for example. The one thing that I think puts Carney from his own internal leadership perspective in a different spot is that Liberals are much better at politics than Conservatives have been, because Conservatives have this pesky thing called principles that they are pretty attached and committed to. And Liberals are not like that. And I don't mean that as disrespectful towards Liberals. It has resulted in them being able to hold power for a long time and ultimately fulfill the goal of what politics is all about, and that is forming government, and that's a skill. I think that if this were an issue that were reversed and it was a Conservative prime minister that was walking back an issue that his caucus cared a lot about, I think there would be much bigger risk. But I think that because this is such a welcome development by so many parts of Canada, and people in the Liberal fold can see the writing on the wall on this. And don't forget, you said we haven't been talking about Trump. Well, we are in a different situation than we were 5 to 10 years ago in terms of our economic options. And I think people see that, and I think people vote with that. I was listening to a few podcasts last week about this, and one of them rightly said, people care about climate change, but not more than they care about eating. So again, we're in a different position now. But I think that Carney has the benefit of being in a political party that is willing to walk things back if it's politically expedient. And so he's got more room to move there.
Yeah, interestingly, the tariff tantrum of the new year, where Donald Trump was making America great again, was arguably the best thing that could have happened to Alberta.
Well, yes, I would argue that
we're still shipping the same amount of oil.
I would argue that had there been, I don't want to do revisionist history here, but had there been, Alberta ended up being well-placed because they the result was that we got Carney, who's willing to have this conversation, which I think is notionally good. And if Carney had failed, or the Liberals had failed and kept Trudeau, then we would have had a Conservative premier, which would have obviously been good. So I think you're right. Alberta did come out like a bandit in this situation, which is, I think, good. And honestly, Alberta deserves a W after the past decade of being bludgeoned by harmful policies from Ottawa with blatant disregard. So if I may be so bold.
No, completely agree. So now let's discuss Smith a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Premier Smith, maybe with a soft C, campaigned on sovereignty and fighting Ottawa. Now she's agreed to triple the carbon tax to $130 a ton. It feels as though she blinked a little bit on this deal. Did she trade something here for what is certainly perceived locally as a political win? And does this now focus, rightly or wrongly, more on her provincial policy and some of the files that have been ignored due to mostly this province cares about commodity exports? They care about the economy. That's what wins in Alberta. Now it feels as though she has struck to me, she's won something here. This is a very impressive opportunity that seems to me on its face good. I think that this now changes the political climate and the focus for her. What do you think?
It's a great question. So I'm going to just take a step back and frame that a bit, because part of the separation argument for those who support it is not a question of liking Ottawa. It's a question of whether remaining in Canada is tenable for Alberta's economic
it's oil
future.
Egress, basically.
But there's other issues other than just oil too. Like there's a lot of other things that separatists care about. I'm not a separatist, but I understand that this is not just primarily an oil and gas driven argument. So the question is, on the separatism argument, is it tenable for Alberta to stay in Canada? Does Alberta have a future in this country? Meaning, are there pathways or glimmers of hope that our position as part of this federation, being part of Confederation, is there hope there? And part of what I think that Smith has done with this deal is answered that question by saying, yes, there is hope. Because whereas we thought previously that a Liberal government, if we are destined to have Liberal governments in Ottawa forevermore, we are destined to continue to experience the same policy and regulatory and legislative conditions that we have known in the past. And I think that part of what Smith has tried to do with this is make the argument for, we've made progress, we have changed, there is still a path forward in Canada, and to try and pivot now, because Alberta is going into an election in 2027 or perhaps sooner, and separatism is not necessarily a winning political strategy. Smith, with this deal, I think, is able to say, listen, it is actually tenable to stay in Canada. Look at how we're getting some movement from the federal government. And now we can sort of get into whether or not she was the one who sort of incentivized some of the folks that were saying those things to champion that cause. She says she's not a separatist, but I think you could argue that there's a lot of things that have been said over the past few years.
Started a few of the fires. Let's put it that way.
I think that would be fair to say. So I think that part of this is making that argument of, look what we were able to do on energy, depending on what ends up happening. Let's sort of look at some of these other issues too. And it is no coincidence that Alberta this week is going to be introducing a motion in the legislature under the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act about ignoring federal gun laws when it comes to the buyback program and enforcing that. So again, this idea that Alberta is just going to stop fighting with Ottawa is, I think, not the case. I think that there may be a better working relationship with Ottawa if things go well on the MOU, but it is the formula politically for any premier in Alberta, conservative, progressive conservative, NDP or otherwise, to fight with Ottawa. So they're not going to stop fighting with Ottawa. but maybe they'll just start focusing on other issues and go from there.
Music to my ears, quite frankly.
So, sorry, but the last thing, sorry, I did not answer your question, but at the AGM this weekend, the thing that I think that you're talking about is that Smith has some people within the party on the very far right and in the separatist camp that do not believe that this MOU is evidence that Alberta can be tenable within Canada. And so the blowback she's getting internally, politically, which I think will subside over the next few months, is from people who think that this is not enough evidence that Alberta can stay within Canada and be viable. So just want to close the loop on that because you were asking about internal.
Okay. Is that a pretty loud group? Is it a majority?
It is not a majority. They did not win a majority on the board. There was worry about that. There are 11 of 17 or 18 seats on the board that are non-separatist people. So it is not a majority, but it is a loud, vocal, mobilized, and motivated
That's a third,
minority.
though. That's a lot.
Yep. No, it's not insignificant. So we don't necessarily have to get into the details on this, but part of the anecdote on that is for people who maybe have left the UCP or active involvement in the UCP is like to get back involved at the level of sort of evening that out a little bit, because the mechanisms are there. The party has not been taken over entirely by separatists. It's a strong section of people, but there are a lot of people who don't believe that in the party as well. And I think there's room for all voices within the UCP. Just we got to look at what we're actually governing and legislating on when it comes to policy.
So this pushes me into we'll call it the industry, the economic impact here. So this MOU explicitly says no pathways, CCUS, no pipeline. This forces the big six, so like CNRL, Cenovus, Suncor, Imperial Oil, MEG, Athabasca, like all the big, large producers to come to the table. So this is the Pathways Alliance, and start spending. From my perspective, and this is the perspective of somebody who is kind of watched their balance sheets pile up. For the last 6 years, we've seen a massive focus on debt pay down, a balance sheet cleanup where we've gone from a period of time from we call it 2010 through to 2015, where the market was in growth mode, investment mode, CapEx mode. They then shifted due to policy, as everyone can likely remember. 2015 was when our great ruler Trudeau got in, and the headwinds started to pile up. Now, those existed earlier, but got worse. And the foreign and domestic investment in the commodity and we'll call it drilling, exploration, growth side of the oil and gas industry in Western Canada slowed to a trickle. Effectively, any new drilling was just to replace inventory, and they utilized the egress that was available. Most egress expansion was, for the most part, via railways, and we were unable to really grow the industry. Now we fast forward throughout that time period, that 10-year situation where we've seen COVID, oil prices go from negative 36 to 125, back down to 50, and WCS traded a discount the entire time, discount to WTI. These oil and gas companies have become very efficient, very low leverage, and have done a fantastic job having a fairly good return profile if you're returning capital to shareholders. When you start to dangle the carrot of opportunity, that's when and how you see capital return to the industry. This is how you see economic growth, GDP expansion, new jobs. If you're just replacing inventories to fill the current pipeline, you don't see projects that are for or growth oriented, where they start to add new employees. You're really just replacing people that are retiring. So what this to me is, the big six now need to put up or shut up. So it sounds ridiculous, but if we do not see
Joel, I'm in Calgary. You got to watch it on this podcast. Jeez.
Well, no. But it's true. Like if they don't, they've been calling for egress opportunity since I was born. And if they are wanting to see a future for our industry beyond 4.5 million barrels a day, where we can actually see 25% growth over the next 10 years in terms of egress opportunity by pipeline, they need to get this big capital expenditure underway. Now, there's going to be a trilateral agreement. There's going to be tax incentives. There's going to be government that comes, or at least it seems this way based on the MOU, to come to their support. Now, from an investor's perspective, if you're adding 1.2 million barrels, where you're going to be able to ship west to Asian markets, your WCS discount should theoretically be erased. Now, maybe it's $5 discount, whatever. Does that $10 benefit as a multiplier of on a per barrel extraction and delivery benefit the balance sheet enough to make up for the amount of capex required to build out this new capacity? Now, I can't tell you yes or no if that's true, but that's the economic decision that these companies need to come to. And if the federal government and the provincial government don't de-risk these planned projects sufficiently for them to pencil this out and be like, you know what, if we're going to continue to drill and export for 50 years, we need this capacity. We have to do this. This CapEx program has to happen. So what the federal government and the provincial government, I think, is trying to do is they're trying to provide clarity to these big six companies to justify their involvement in expanding the amount of oil and gas that we're able to ship. And so is this $16 billion carbon capture network worth the money? Is the $20 billion pipeline worth the money? I think right now we don't know without understanding what the program or the plan that's going to be deliverable by April looks like, and what the provincial plan is deliverable by July looks like. And that's when I think the market will start to react, because currently they just care about what the data center, how many data centers are coming online, how that impacts gas prices, how those gas prices then impact oil prices, and how much consumption there's going to be globally. Because until we get additional egress west, there's really no economic difference versus tomorrow. Markets price stocks based on 9 months, not based on 5 and 10 year programs or plans.
So I will just say, when it comes to the pathways stuff, like we get mired in the details of like the production side of things, but fundamentally when it comes to why pathways exist largely as a response to the increasing regulatory and climate expectations of industry, of a very high energy intensive, emissions intensive industry that was put in place during the Trudeau era, right? So pathways is big industries largely, I'm paraphrasing here, but is their response to how they can address reducing emissions in a way that doesn't say we can't do the things that we do anymore. And so this is, I think, where you're right in saying that the federal and provincial governments do have to have a role at the table, because the reason for big projects that reduce emissions, yes, it's environmental. And yes, some of that is priced into ESG and all of these other market forces. But fundamentally, it's a response to government regulation and impediments that have been put on the industry. And you can have a conversation about environment or energy intensity or whatever you want to have a conversation about. But part of this is realizing that Canada does rely on these companies for the economic backbone. Canada needs these companies to be doing what they do best in an environmentally friendly and responsible way, which many of them do on their own and are very good at. But again, this is why, like, to just reinforce your point, this is in response to federal government policy and is a way to sort of have this other kind of grand bargain of reducing emissions, being responsible with the certainty of what's to come. And what has been lacking, based on my assessment in that relationship, is that there are several commitments expected of industry with very little certainty provided from the government that it is going to be a give and take. And I think that is where, if people are nervous about this MOU or the future, nobody would ever put me in charge of a large energy company, but I'm not going to be agreeing to that much CapEx without some certainty or some support and government buy-in. And it's not just, hey, give us money for XYZ project. It's, are you going to give us the certainty that we can continue to produce and exist in a way that makes financial sense for our company? So I wanted to add that, because I think that's a very important nuance when it comes to talking about this stuff. The government needs these companies, and the companies need the government. It is a symbiotic relationship that has to happen if we're going to reach economic and climate goals in the way that these folks want to.
100% agree. And when folks say, if we had a perfect free market, which doesn't exist anywhere in the world, as an FYI, the reality is that you would build it and they would come and all things would be great. But we live in a world where governments participate in energy markets everywhere else. And for the longest time, Alberta has, and well, Canada has, not exactly gotten out of its own way. And as a result, we have not increased our export as a percentage on a per capita basis. So certainly we've grown the market. We've continued to export more oil, but we haven't been able to grow it as a percentage of the actual overall market itself. We have lagged behind our direct competitors south. And luckily, we're starting to see some appetite to de-risk continued growth of this sector, which benefits the entire country. Completely agree with you on all of those points, Mel. And I think where I'd like to go next is more so on a profitability outlook, like how this all likely plays out from my perspective. So we talked about CapEx. So this CapEx is it's a $20 to $40 billion when you include CCUS. So that's a pretty large capital outlay. That's a lot of money for these companies. They don't generate hundreds of billions of dollars in cash flow like Facebook or the major tech companies in the United States. This is a very big project. Now, how does the government incentivize them? So you have this offsetting factor of where they'll have ITCs, which are federal investment tax credits. You'll have the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program that will absorb a significant portion of this CCUS CapEx, kind of softening the blow to the balance sheets of these oil companies. I also would add that if you were to add $10 or $15 per barrel of oil sold, where we're now equal with WTI, that too almost entirely covers most of this cost. Now, obviously, I don't know exactly where we're going to have oil prices in 3 months, let alone in 4 or 5 years. But these are the ways in which the government can help de-risk this project and then give some visibility into the future for these oil companies to make that investment. From a profitability perspective, I think it's really important to kind of look at the major players here. CNRL and Cenovus are your majors they're the largest producers in the province. They have the most to gain from this. If you can narrow WCS, they're going to do better. You have Suncor and Imperial Oil, which are much more integrated, but likely are going to benefit from the fact that they have some international talent. This is, to an extent, plays into their playbook in terms of they're globally diversified, and not only that, they're downstream, upstream, midstream, all diversified across that, and they're going to likely be able to operationally take advantage. And MEG Energy's got just unlimited leverage here. They're kind of the pure play oil sands producer, and they're very, very sensitive to differentials. So if you have a $10, $15 discount, they don't do as well. The closer you inch to WTI on an even basis, they're going to do better. Now, what does this all mean? If all this works out from my perspective, I'm very bullish Alberta. This is just such a terrific outcome for us. It allows for my generation, people in their 30s that are wanting to be entrepreneurial. It gives them some clarity and some view into the future that doesn't feel so negative sum. This is a positive sum opportunity. The pie can now finally expand and grow like it was proposed to us back in 2005 to 2008. I feel like when I came out of high school, everybody was going to engineering school because the oil and gas industry was hot. You fast forward 10 years, and when my youngest brother graduates high school, everyone wants to go into business and marketing. I think if you were to ask a 15-year-old in 3 years from now what he wants to go into school, I think that our educational system will have gone full circle, and engineering and we'll call it the more blue collar, industrial, manufacturing, oil and gas sectors will be demanding and have much more opportunity. And as a result, there's going to be more people going to school for that. And I think that just when you narrow down and look at Alberta specifically, is usually when things are going and doing its best, when our province is firing on all cylinders. So for that, I'm very, very excited. Mel, I don't know if you want to discuss perhaps we'll call it the data centers and the nuclear play here. To me, that was kind of just more of a political theater and buzzword addition, but maybe you know more about it than me.
No, I think that the data center and nuclear stuff obviously heavily related to what's going on in electricity. And of course, our grid in Alberta is very much powered by natural gas. So I think it's all connected just in terms of understanding that this is going to be a process that happens over the next several years and decades. And I think that just an acknowledgement of all of the ways in which the oil and gas sector doesn't just impact pipelines, it impacts electricity, it impacts, plastics. All of these areas are very, very important. And so I think it's all related. And I think because Alberta's blessed and maybe in some ways cursed with being a natural resource superpower, it's not just a simple question of pipelines is going to impact pipelines. It's pipelines going to impact a lot of other aspects of government, of industry. And I think Alberta has always been a leader in that way. And so it's nice to see that there is that recognition from other orders of governments, or at least the embers of that recognition. I'm really excited. It has been after the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, when we were coming out of high school, it's been a rough couple of decades for a lot of people who sort of had anticipated that they would experience the same kind of economic growth from our oil and gas sector and our economy that generations before had experienced. And so I'm hopeful that we come back to that hope and that we all start orienting ourselves in the direction to do that in a responsible, sustainable way, economically as well as environmentally. So I'm excited, and I hope that this is an opportunity where everybody can do their part. That now is really where the work begins. So let's get to it.
Okay, hot spot or hot seat for you. 2030 prediction. It's 2030. Does this pipeline actually exist, or is this MOU going to be remembered as kind of like a paper pipeline?
2030, I think this pipeline will exist or be very, very close to existing, like on the way. I do.
I love that. That's great. I think that's it for me. There's not much else I want to discuss, and perhaps as we continue to do these conversations, we can talk a little bit more in the future about perhaps the future of the Indigenous equity piece, the BC blockade, whether or not it actually happens. Are there any missing proponents that need to be kicked in here? I'm going to be watching it very closely because it is important to clients of mine. It's important to our economy. And I'm hopeful that if this does push forward and they can get some shovels in the ground, that our provincial government also sees this as an opportunity to expand and grow other parts of our economy, or other parts of our services, perhaps invest in taking care of the ever-growing population. So
stay tuned.
Stay tuned. Well, Mel, thank you so much for your time. It's always a delight. And I look forward to chatting with you in 2 weeks.
Awesome. See you in a couple of weeks, Joel. Take care.
Bye. That's all for today. Thanks for listening. If you found this valuable, please subscribe and share it with a friend. As always, the information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial and/or tax advice. Please consult a licensed professional for your own personal situation. Joel is a registered portfolio manager and investment advisor, and clients of his and his firm may own securities discussed on this podcast.